On this channel, we've delved into the lore and the stories of many different groups, individuals, and entities that populate the universe of Starfield. Yet it feels like when we spacefarers examine many of these things, we often overlook the more obvious things in front of us and take those same things for granted or as a given. In this video, we'll be looking at the history and the lore and the organization's constellation that we spacefarers can join, what we know of its past and current members, along with a surprisingly dark secret the seemingly innocuous group of explorers held. After all, Constellation is actually, well, everywhere, in and outside of Starfield, yet not many of us have dug into the lore of it yet. There will be spoilers in this video, and as always, if you're interested in more lore, definitely check out the other videos on the channel. We're also going to be expanding the lore videos to different games even more, so feel free to make a suggestion on what game you'd like to see more lore videos on down in the comments below. And if you want to find out more about Starfield, check out my partner, StarfieldWiki.net, run by the team behind UESP. It's made clear in numerous dialogues and encounters that the explorer organization Constellation has something of a mythical or legendary reputation that precedes its members throughout the settled systems. Constellation has such a well-known reputation that many think it's an old legend, or at least no longer an active organization within the political context of the 24th century, when supposedly everything in the galaxy that needs to be explored has been explored. Children aspire to be Constellation explorers. Crimson Fleet pirates believe Constellation members possess treasure from their explorations, and even our parents express awe and some jealousy when we tell them that we've joined Constellation. To understand Constellation's place in the universe, we of course have to look at its history from both the objective and personal perspectives. Imagine that you are born almost 2 centuries after the destruction of Earth and remnants of humanity are still colonizing the known galaxy. You're born into a time period of uncertainty and instability as a result of the Nerian War, the first intergalactic war between the human factions of the United Colonies and the Freestar Collective that took place from the year 2194 to 2216. Your life's prospects are made worse by the sudden and quite violent Serpent's Crusade waged by House Varun that lasts over 2 decades from the year 2240 to 2260, which only contributes further to the senseless violence and despair of the time. As the future continues to remain uncertain, sometime later in the year 2275, you hear hopeful rumors of a new organization that calls itself Constellation, a group of space explorers who, despite the stagnation of humanity's progress among the stars, still believe that beyond the petty politics, beyond the worries of everyday life, that there are still wonders and exciting discoveries to be made in the universe, a thought that certainly speaks to the powerful curiosity found in every human being throughout our species' history. In the year 2275, 55 years before the events of Starfield, Constellation was founded by its founder and first chair, Sebastian Banks. Alongside Banks were the founding members such as Chloe Bao, Darius Andrus, Bernadette Laurent, Everada Gill, Kadri Toma, and Aja Mamasa, who we meet later when traveling and building a relationship with Sarah Morgan, or at a funeral for one of the Constellation members during our time in the multiverse. As if the idea of exploration, above the petty squabbles of humanity, manifested itself in the form of these first Constellation members, the backgrounds of these individuals seem to have varied greatly, without seemingly much serious conflict taking place between them as they built the Lodge in New Atlantis as their home and operations base. Bernadette Laurent was a wealthy heiress and part-time adventurer who undoubtedly helped finance the construction of the Lodge. Everada Gill was a former smuggler who may have helped Constellation with the more shady contacts needed for certain endeavors. Darius Andrus was a specialist in xenoflora and botany. Kadri Toma was a biologist and physician, while Chloe Bao was an accomplished physicist. Aja Mamasa, as a protege of Sebastian Banks and mentor of Sarah Morgan, seemed to have been a jack of all trades with a potential background in diplomacy or military affairs. At the very least, since Aja had been 5th chair of Constellation for 35 years, she definitely has leadership qualities that held the fabric of Constellation together. The original founder and chair of Constellation, Sebastian Banks, is perhaps the most intriguing and mysterious member of Constellation. Who was this man that decided to pursue exploration in a time when people weren't interested in exploring? Who was this man charismatic enough to bring together individuals who would otherwise have never met outside of Constellation? His mystique is enhanced by his momentous decision of voluntarily stepping down from leadership of Constellation in the year 2283, 8 years after the organization was founded and made waves. Sebastian Banks also gave a speech when he stepped down, a speech Walter Stroud can recite for us as part of his wife and us teasing him about being a Constellation fanboy.
My colleagues, I venture out into the darkness of space once again. Many of you have expressed concern. At my age, you say, surely the risks are too great. Surely Sebastian Banks has earned a rest. Nonsense, I say. To go out into the unknown, to brave the possibility of never coming back, to ignite the spark of hope that humanity will find answers out there in the stars, that is all I have ever wanted. If this last expedition is my time, then I say, I have been fortunate. I have been fortunate to leave, surrounded by people who could not be more different from one another, but who share a common purpose. That, dare I say, I am fortunate. My soul has a home it can always come back to. And that was the last thing Sebastian Banks ever said in the lodge before he disappeared.
It's clear that Banks was passionate about exploring the unknown and only interested in attaining knowledge as opposed to material gains or political power. While Walter Stroud comments that Constellation has been waiting for him ever since Sebastian Banks departed and left for the unknown reaches of space one final time, we can take this as a flowery metaphor, as by the time he gave his speech, it seems Sebastian was fairly old based on the noting of his age, and he'd be even older now, 47 years after when we spacefarers enter the story. What happened to Sebastian and his ship? We've tried for the longest time to try to see if we can pick up on any clues, any wreckage, or any data slate, but it seems we won't know for the time being what the ultimate fate of Sebastian Banks is. There is also another speech by Sebastian Banks recorded in the year 2276, 1 year after the founding of Constellation and 7 years before he disappeared, which indicates he had great foresight of the tensions that would lead up to the colony war decades later. The following is an excerpt of Constellation founder Sebastian Banks' during 2276 speech to United Colonies leadership about the importance of continued space exploration. That is why, my esteemed peers, I beseech you, do not forego the dreams of humanity, only to plunge civilization into an endless nightmare. The settled system stands once more on the brink of war. And for what? A dispute over space? The cosmos is infinite, and yet, like our earthbound ancestors, we have become selfishly obsessed over what we consider ours. At our core, are we a race of conquerors? Of warriors? No, my friends. If nothing else, humans are explorers. So let us continue exploring. Now is the time to venture beyond the imagined borders of the settled systems and fulfill the dreams of humanity. For if we continue down this path, funding only war and not exploration, I fear there will be no one left to remember why we fought in the first place. It is after Sebastian Banks left Constellation and known space that physicist Chloe Bao became the second chair of Constellation. We know this based on a data slate that recorded a 2283 Settled Systems News Network report about the public perception of Constellation's supposed near collapse, where it said, and although Constellation's relevance has been a subject of much debate amongst the new Atlantis intelligentsia, the disappearance of founder Sebastian Banks was a blow most felt the organization couldn't survive. In fact, Constellation's disbanding seemed imminent until member Chloe Bao changed her vote in the 11th hour, thus ensuring the group's continued operation at least for the time being, as well as her unexpected appointment to the position of chair. There's a few things we can take away from this news report. It seems despite the lack of human interest in space exploration, given the history and also the existence of the grav drives, there was still a lot of public and academic interest in the affairs and discoveries of Constellation, denoting that the group was quite influential. Sebastian Banks' reputation and charisma is again affirmed by the news report, and the fact that Constellation members had a vote to determine whether or not Constellation should even exist is another testament to Banks and also how the original members felt about his absence. Interestingly, Chloe Bao changed her vote last minute, in what we can assume was a deadlock tie between the remaining 6 Constellation members, with perhaps Ajab Mamasa urging Chloe to do so as she was Sebastian's protege. As for why Chloe Bao was the one who became the second chair of Constellation, one would assume it was because she was the one who broke the deadlock, but there's a darker context to be added here that also involves Sebastian's banks, which might explain why, in a writing you can find called Report, the Clark Lewis, authored by Chloe Bao herself. It says,
I breached the hull at approximately 1348 Sol time. As expected, all internal systems were offline. Emergency power had ceased to function years earlier, so I was navigating the ship in 0G. Again, I expected that. Almost immediately, I started seeing the bodies. They were everywhere. The crew, the settlers, all of them, drifting throughout the ship. What surprised me were the obvious variations in the causes of death. Those not in suits were frozen and fairly well preserved, and I imagined some of them actually asphyxiated. Others were emaciated, as if they had starved prior to death and freezing. Others had substantial wounding, gunshots, stab wounds. I even found an arm floating amongst the debris, but not the owner of said arm. It was when I got to the engine room that things finally started to make sense. Due to my approach, I hadn't noticed it from the outside, but half of the compartment was actually gone, completely destroyed. The helium-3 tanks had ruptured, somehow. Sabotage? Faulty equipment? Wasn't clear. But the reactor was gone, blown into space. No helium-3 meant no jumping. No reactor meant no engines. No thrusters. That meant the Clark Lewis was dead in space, forever. A few personal logs I discovered only confirmed what I then assumed. Life on the Clark Lewis developed over the course of the next few years. Some people starved to death, others resorted to violence, and even murder. There was even some compelling, though unsubstantiated evidence indicating cannibalism. For the settled systems at large, the disappearance of the Clark Lewis is a topic of urban legend, like Bigfoot or the Roanoke colony. Part of the myth held that the ship had made it to the Eden-like planet where the settlers had established a kind of utopia. It's a hell of a thing knowing something an entire galaxy does not. Holding on to a truth so terrible, you're not even sure it should see the light of day.
Chloe Bao's extensive 2282 report on the destruction of the Clark Lewis colony ship, which was reported lost in the year 2257, was a subject of much contention within Constellation. At a time when space exploration was already on the decline, Sebastian Banks feared that the horrifying story of the Clark Lewis and its crew would prevent people from venturing out into the dangerous unknowns of space. As evident by her report and the lack of public knowledge about the Clark Lewis colony ship, Chloe could surely keep a secret, which more than likely factored into her becoming the second chair of Constellation. And this gives us some uncertain pause in regard to the morality or ethics of Sebastian Banks, and by extension, Constellation, in keeping the fate of the Clark Lewis a secret from the public for the purpose of not discouraging further space exploration, which would have made Constellation even more irrelevant. This pause with Constellation can be felt sometimes even during our own adventures after we spacefarers join Constellation. Some of this uncertainty can be explained away by Sarah Moyne's ardent belief in individual free will, even when we're making decisions that will have huge impact on the settled systems, such as the decision between anti-terramorph microbial aerosol or the reintroduction of the natural terramorph predator, the Aceles. Oftentimes, we either get praised or berated for our decisions by the other Constellation members, which honestly shouldn't be what we focus on because the greater implication by them doing so and deciding that stat comes off as, well, elitist in determining just one individual or group could decide such things, or that ultimately one of us Constellation members may just know better than millions of others out there, even if objectively it is bad helping the Crimson Fleet pirates take out the United Colonies' SysDef forces. At this point, let's talk about what we can refer to as the transitional period within Constellation. Sometime after Chloe Bao resigned or died, it's unclear who the third chair of Constellation was between Sir Malcolm Livingstone and Vizola Chen, the latter who wrote a popular science fiction novel called Sword of Damocles, which reads,
Damocles Grey looked up into the eyes of the reptilian High King and grinned. Well, boots. I think it's time I made my exit, he quipped. Then, raising his wrist-mounted comm device to his mouth, he said the words he had uttered so many times before. Let's do it, baby. A second later, Damocles Gray's sleek chromium death ship crashed through the palace stained glass dome, raining lasers on any lizard man its targeting computers could get a lock on. It's the sword! Everybody run! But the High King never got to finish his command, because a gaping hole now stood in the space where his mouth used to be, blasted straight through by one of the ship's laser beam guns. The sword then came to a hover 2 inches off the ground, right next to Damocles Gray. That's for Earth, you ugly iguanas, he said as he swung up into the cockpit and closed the canopy. Seconds later, there was no indication Damocles Gray had ever been on the planet Reptiliar 3, except for the pile of dead reptilians left in his wake.
The science fiction novel Sword of Damocles was written by former Constellation chair Vizola Chen after retirement, writing under the pen name Victoria Star. Although over 1 million copies were printed, very few actually sold, and eventually, Chen decided to distribute the book for free. Now, Sword of Damocles is something of a pop culture staple, and copies can be found throughout the settled systems. More than likely, the third chair would have been Sir Malcolm Livingstone, who must have joined sometime during or after Chloe Bao's time as chair, while Vizola Chen more than likely was the fifth chair of Constellation, as Ajamamasa's diary indicates she was the one who recruited Vizola Chen into Constellation. We also know a little bit more based on Livingstone's journals, so let's examine the first, which might have a typo by the way, as the intro blurb refers to Sebastian Banks and not Sir Livingstone in regards to the subject's contributions. Sir Malcolm Livingstone's appointment to the role of Constellation Chair was controversial to say the least, as he essentially bought his way into the position. Nevertheless, Banks' contributions to the organization were substantial, as evidenced by this excerpt from his personal journal. In time, the others will come to accept me as chair, I'm sure. Until then, I remain committed to improving this organization to the best of my abilities, and if those improvements rely even more on my already considerable monetary contributions, then so be it. I agreed we needed a robot, but disagreed with the purchase of a newer Model A. Lunar robotics is a shadow of what it once was. Instead, I managed to procure an original Model A manufactured on the moon, bought him for a song, found him rustling in some junk heap in Aquila City. I'm having him refurbished as I write this. In a couple days, he'll be good as new. I've decided to name him Vasco, and like his namesake, I imagine he'll be as flawed as he is effective. My next step is renovating the lodge. Sebastian Banks has the good sense to name the building appropriately, but it's time to inject a bit of old world grandeur. If we are to be the gatekeepers of art, science, culture, and exploration, our headquarters must express that. It's time I called in some favors and searched in those hidden corners of the settled systems to procure the things that would truly make this place come alive. There are some treasures from old Earth that desperately need an appropriate home. If we are to acknowledge that Vasco has been in operation for over 40 years since the year 2287, and Sarah Morgan became the 6th chair of Constellation in the year 2325, with Ajamamasa and Vizola Chen preceding her as the 4th and 5th chairs of Constellation for at least 35 plus years, which would have started in the late 2280s at the earliest, then Vizola Chen would indeed be the 5th chair of Constellation, who must have been chair for only a very short time right before Sarah Morgan. We're going to pivot back to the topic of Livingstone, who definitely had some grand ideas on the roles Constellation should fulfill. The wealthy Livingstone's comments on the gatekeeping and preservation of the arts, sciences, culture, and exploration imply he viewed Constellation and himself certainly as a bastion or vault keeper of humanity's greatest feats. Livingstone seemed to have also had a fascination with history, going so far as to own an old Earth pistol that our parents can give us. Like all historians, Livingstone understood that it wasn't just intangible achievements that demonstrated power, glory, or success, but also architecture and symbols, which led to his desire in procuring treasures to decorate and renovate the lodge. In his second journal, which reveals the location of the first lunar landing by humanity in 1969, Livingstone writes, I heard tell from some of the old timers that although the Earth suffered its sad fate, that her faithful companion, Luna, fared much better. Apparently, you can still find remnants of one of the old Apollo missions, something of a secret rite of passage for chairs of Constellation, if Banks was to be believed. During one of those rare interludes of calm while doing other research on Earth, I figured I could spare the time. I was, as they say, in the neighborhood. It took some serious scanning and a couple false leads, but I found it. To walk in the same place as those earliest of interstellar explorers. Unbelievable what they achieved with such primitive technology. I found the whole experience moving, inspiring. I will advise my successor to do the same. We'll make a proper tradition of it, yet. After Livingstone presumably died or resigned, Aja Mamasa, who was the youngest founding member of Constellation, would finally have her time as the 4th chair of Constellation. A remarkable tenure of 35 years would follow from circa 2290 until the 2320s, much longer than all of her great predecessors combined. During this time, Aja would see to the recruitment of Barrett in the year 2305, who would later discover the mysterious nature of the artifacts. Aja would also recruit the following individuals, some of whom we've never seen in the game. Ervin Madani, a FC biologist and physician, Alice Campbell, an accomplished pilot, Russell Luther, a former FC veteran and astronomer, philosopher and historian Visolo Chen, and finally Jin Tao Min, who was once allegedly a hitman in Neon. She would also oversee Constellation's first artifact, which would be tucked away in their archives for 20 years, from 2310 until the year 2326, 4 years before the events of Starfield when Barrett would discover its anomalous properties. Unfortunately, it's during this period of time from the year 2307 until 2311 that the devastating colony war takes place, which further diminished the influence and relevancy of Constellation and humanity's interest in exploration as a result of the violent instability that would follow. Additionally, the colony war took the life of Ervin Madani, another Constellation member and husband of Barrett, a story we'll examine in another video. Finally, in the year 2320, Sarah Morgan joined Constellation under the tutelage of Aja Mamasa. In the following years, wealthy corporate owner Walter Stroud and former Crimson Fleet pirate Vladimir Saul would join Constellation. In the year 2325, Aja Mamasa has left Constellation and departed for Paradiso as part of her retirement, leaving Sarah Morgan as the effective 6th chair of Constellation. In the same year, Sanctum Universum follower and theologian Matteo Catri joins Constellation after getting into a dispute with Walter Stroud. Shortly after, former Freestar Ranger Sam Coe and his young daughter Cora Coe joined Constellation. A year after, Andrasia, who turned out to be a House of Ruin smuggler and agent, joins Constellation. In the same year, Barrett proposes the purchase of Star Station L868 that acts as a deep space scanner, which we spacefarers know as the Eye. We also find out that Noel, Sarah Morgan's protege and science prodigy, joined Constellation in the year 2326. Interestingly, it is Vladimir, Noel, Walter, and Matteo who remain behind, at least in our starting universe, should we, accompanied by the others, decide to journey to the Unity and become Starboard, with Vladimir taking effective charge and Noel more than likely becoming the eventual 7th or 8th chair of Constellation, backed by Walter's finances and tempered by Matteo's theology. The incredible variety in the backgrounds and personas of the current Constellation continues to exemplify at least some of Sebastian Banks' original intention, with exploration taking priority above all creeds, races, and distinguishing marks we often still fight over in our and Starfield's reality. It's also at this point we can refer to this period of time from the year 2328 to 2330 and onwards as the current period, when the familiar roster of Constellation from Vasco de Serra is showcased in our many adventures as Spacefarer and Starborn. Curiously enough, Constellation seems to attract the Starborn, or at least the Starboard in our backyard of the multiverse, owing due to both canon and probably game limitations. One could point to potentially the first artifact in possession of the Constellation being a sort of anchor or magnet that forced some of the multiple timelines and universes to occur from that single point on, But that's another video for another time. I hope you guys enjoyed this brief lore video on Constellation. There's definitely some interesting themes going on with the organization and the history behind some of its members, which end up pointing to these people, with the exception of Vasco, as not exactly being the ideal or epitome of being human, but as an attempt to be so, for good or for worse. If you enjoyed this lore video and want more, I've made some longer ones that you can check out, and if you want to support me, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much. You guys have been so great this year. Have a great Thanksgiving if you celebrate it, and see you guys next time.